What I've noticed so far is that most of the focus has tended to be on exhibitions in light of material objects so far. So my paper is really going to pull away from that a little bit and talk about the role of performance and actually having the artists be present and what effect that has on the understandings that we have of South Asia in relationship to Britain. So in the context of today's panel on artistic networks and collaborations, my paper considers partnerships and exchanges between contemporary artists, particularly those working in the media of performance and participatory art, and their work that they do with established museums. So since the 1990s, it has become increasingly common to see performance art staged within a range of museum contexts and settings. These works take many forms, yet often draw on performance art's ability to engage with live audiences, to draw and engage the audiences in participatory gestures, and to stimulate discussions. While some scholars and artists would argue that this has essentially killed the medium by removing its uncertainty, its immediacy, its time specificity, real-life engagement, and at times also danger, I'm of the opinion that performance staged inside and outside the museum constitute two different forms of art. They are subject to different constraints and facilities, and demand different outcomes. So in light of this, I will focus today on participatory art commissioned by and staged within museums which normally house ethnographic, historic, or education-oriented collections. I will look particularly at the phenomenon of museum interventions, the practice of museums actively inviting artists whose previous work has addressed the history of colonialism or post-colonial migrations. This practice is by no means new nor specific to Britain. Afro-American artist Fred Wilson has referred to this form of art making as a process of mining and explains, and I quote here, "It could mean mining as in gold mine, digging up something rich with meaning, or as in landmine, exploding myths and perceptions, or it could just mean making it mine." Elsewhere, art theorist and curator Ariella Azule has referred to an archive fever sweeping through contemporary art practice, where she says, and I quote, "Archive fever challenges the traditional protocols by which official archives have functioned and continue to do so. It proposes new models of sharing the documents stored therein in ways that requires one to think of the public's right to archive not as external to the archive, but rather as an essential part of it, of its character, of its raison d'être. In 1992 to 93, the aforementioned artist Fred Wilson created arguably one of the first museum interventions in the Maryland Historical Society, in which he rearranged the museum's displays in order to highlight hidden histories pertaining to slavery and colonialism. In the artist's own words, "Often what museums put on view says a lot about the museum, but what they don't says even more." Through this rearrangement, Wilson temporarily disrupted the museum's exhibition order, thus stimulating the viewers to form new associations and connections which would normally lie hidden beneath the permanent displays. Similarly, a number of museums in Britain have allowed artistic residencies and temporary projects to take place amidst their displays and to draw on their archives. Notably here is Shuttapa Biswas's installation Tinker Tailor Soldier Sailor at the Pitt Rivers Museum from 1994. This is a prime example of an artist working to disrupt the curatorial order. Here, Biswas projected a quote from the well-known Victorian rhyme, which goes, "Tinker Tailor, soldier sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, ... thus leaving the final word of the verse, thief, absent and inviting the viewers to complete the lines. Projecting this verse onto one of the central elevated boats in the Pitt Rivers display, the work was intended to call into question the practice of taxonomy, which not only underpinned Augustus Pitt Rivers' collecting practices, but also Victorian-age systems of classification, which established hierarchies of value, both for objects and people. Furthermore, Biswas's personalized inscription on the boat's sail was a reference to the histories of maritime travel, which had shaped the colonial era of Britain in South Asia, as well as enabled post-colonial migrations of South Asians to Britain after the Second World War, amongst whom were the artist and her own family who migrated to Britain by way of ship in the 1970s. Likewise, there is also Ansuman Biswas's durational performance, Manchester Hermit, staged at the Manchester Museum in 2009. Here, the artist resided in the museum for 40 days, presenting objects from the museum's archive via an online blog. Through this online presence, Biswas was able to stimulate a public discussion around the value of objects, even going as far as threatening to destroy them if the public deemed them to be not important enough. In both cases, I would say that the artists employ elements of public engagement in order to create performative art, which questions the museum's collecting and archiving practices, as well as highlighted the connections between material objects in the present and historical pasts. Viewing the museum as archive, in the words of Terry Smith, it may seem at first that these projects produced actual changes in the museum's curatorial and archiving orders, whilst highlighting the hidden stories and lost voices. Yet it is worthwhile asking ourselves whether such projects indeed achieve their goals of making visible and disrupting existing formations of knowledge in museum collections. Should we be expecting contemporary art to produce changes in archives and displays? Given the fact that these works existed by virtue of having the permission of the museums, I would argue that they also, in part, reflect the museum's own outreach agendas. I raise this point with an eye towards one specific performance, the large-scale participatory artwork made in 2006 by the name of Priceless. Commissioned by the Serpentine Gallery in partnership with the Exhibition Road Cultural Group, currently known by the name of Discover South Kensington, and also working with the organization Platform for Art. This work was produced under the creative directorship of the artists collective Moti Roti, headed by Ali Zaidi at this point. Working in collaboration with the independent artists Fulomi Desai and Dan Sol. The request to produce a large-scale, publicly engaging participatory work sat comfortably within the history of Moti Roti. Since 1988, the collective had produced numerous multimedia and performance-based projects, often drawing energy from debates around public engagement, cultural diversity, and art as a source of community building. Thus, Priceless was conceived as a means to unearth and make visible histories in the museum's collections by way of socially engaging art. Officially described as a brave experiment and an ambitious project, Priceless set out to bring about the collaboration and participation of many of Exhibition Road's cultural institutions through the context of contemporary art. Originally considering naming the project Precious, Ali Zaidi, Fulomi Desai, and Dan Sol settled upon the title of Priceless instead. The notion of price, or monetary worth, stood out as a central point of inquiry in this title. How do museums, particularly ethnographic museums, appraise the value of the objects in their collections on the spectrum between monetary, historical, and human worth? Here, the notion of pricelessness held an important conceptual link also to the work's site-specific nature on Exhibition Road in South Kensington. This was the site of the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations held in Hyde Park in 1851. The area is also known as Albertopolis, marking the site of an exposition which set the precedent for a series of international exhibitions showcasing new technologies and means of production, as well as arts, crafts, and natural resources from different countries. And if you go there today, at the moment, actually outside the Royal Geographic Society, there's a bit of an exhibition which sort of tries to contextualize it also within the history of empire. So within this physical context, the notion of pricelessness was adopted in reference to how much of this colonial history is overlooked in our present-day appreciation of the site as one of London's top tourist sites, which is what it is at the moment. In the words of Ali Zaidi, the project was meant to, and I quote here, reveal the barely visible and the barely audible. In particular, the artists were interested in the value of human labor, both that of the present-day staff of curators and administrators, hidden away from public view inside the museums, as well as the lost voices of the subjects of the colonial exhibitions, including, in the case, for instance, of the Colonial in India exhibition of 1886, not only artifacts, but also living displays of people, in some cases inmates from Agra jail who were specially trained to perform as traditional craftsmen in order to be showcased in London. So reflecting upon the site's historic value for museum histories, The notion of pricelessness was also intended by the artists to reflect upon the contemporary context by calling into question the value of visitors and visitor experiences to the museums, particularly as many of them had adopted programs to attract culturally diverse audiences already in the 1990s. So working with Imperial College, the Natural History Museum, Platform for Art in the South Kensington Underground Station, the Royal Geographic Society with IBG, the Goethe Institute, the V&A, the Serpentine Gallery, and the Royal Parks. The project invited each institution to nominate an object of priceless worth to its organization. The nominated objects included things like the Theobroma cacao plant from the Natural History Museum, an 18th century jade sculpture of a monkey and its young with a peach from the V&A, the 2006 outdoor pavilion of the Serpentine Gallery, a provision list from Harrods for Scott's National Antarctic Exhibition of 1901 from the Royal Geographic Society, and in the case of the Science Museum, the entire ship's gallery, among others. While the project entailed numerous site-specific installations, videos and photographic works, live performances and guided tours, the heart of the work lay in its participatory events, which the artists called road shows, which were run in collaboration with the museum staff from the 26th of April to the 12th of May in 2006. Here, the nominated objects became the subjects of interactive events held inside each respective museum and were attended by a target audience specifically selected by each institution. Framed in the accompanying essay as acts of relational aesthetics, the road shows had a temporary community building function. They brought together different audiences, often groups from minority communities, into the museum to participate in works which, it was assumed, they would normally not be inclined to attend. These groups were then invited to attend the project's opening night on August 11th, in which the multicultural nature of the project served as a point of celebration. For the purposes of this conference, I would like to focus on one specific roadshow which I believe strongly pertains to the history and contemporary representation of South Asia within the context of these museums. The event I'm referring to might come as a bit of a surprise because actually it was the roadshow that was initiated from the Science Museum. Here, working with Dr. Daniel Albert, the former curator of transport, the Science Museum, as I said before, nominated its entire ship's gallery as its priceless object. According to the artists, the gallery was described by the staff at the time as one of the most overlooked galleries in the museum. Its nomination as priceless object was thus intended on the part of the museum to draw publicity to the gallery, as well as to emphasize the importance of ships in the making of modern-day Britain. This latter point is important, for it pertains not only to Britain's own economic and industrial development, but also to the role of ships in the formation of present-day British society, I would add. For instance, ships have been at the core of much migration from South Asia to Britain for a large part of the last 2 centuries. Looking back from the time of indentured labor through to post-colonial mass migrations from peoples from South Asia to Britain by way of boat, the idea of crossing the oceans has held a prominent place in the historic and artistic memory of British South Asian communities, as seen in the very title of an exhibition organized by Panchayat entitled Crossing Black Waters from 1992, for instance. In the foreword of this exhibition catalogue, Shaheen Merali poignantly describes the multifaceted significance of maritime travel in the experiences and perceptions of South Asians in Britain, and I quote him here. "There are thousands of stories to tell, a vast untold human experience. Like stolen treasures buried in the vaults of celebrated museums, they remain silenced witnesses to the passage of time. Their accounts, their unbolting of the closed doors of documented history, throws open the paths for exploration, rediscovery, and recharting of time. Crossing Black Waters is a step along this journey of cultural assertion and reclamation. The title itself refers to a transgression of boundaries, stepping into the unknown, Kalapani, black waters, were the oceans surrounding the Indian subcontinent. To cross them was to break tradition and to sever one's link with the homeland. Paradoxically, the same South Asian migrants found themselves marginalized as outcast by institutional racism within Britain, exclusionary immigration laws, restrictive policies in education, employment, and housing, end quote. Touching upon this long-standing relationship between South Asian migrations to Britain and the museum's intention with choosing the ship's gallery in order to serve as a performative site of memory, and that's a term that I borrow from art historian Nora Taylor. However, here I'd like to point out a certain contradiction, and that's that the target group that the museum actually selected were 15 women from the Muslim women's group from the Muslim Cultural Center. The subsequent roadshow comprised a collective act of singing led by Palestinian singer Reem Kelani, taking place inside the gallery, and an opportunity for the 15 women to share their memories of migration and to write thoughts and recollections triggered by the space on paper boats. While the event has been described by all three artists as a moving and emotional performance, I would argue that this performance is illustrative of some of the lingering problems with the present-day contextualization of the South Asian diaspora, among other diasporas here in the UK. Firstly, the choice of the target audience, Muslim women's group, reduces a range of experiences and personal backgrounds into one category. In conversations with the artists, they have also described to me how the group in fact comprised not only women from South Asian backgrounds, but also from East Africa and the Middle East. According to Dan Soul, some of the subgroups were unable to communicate with the others as they'd only recently moved to the UK and didn't have sufficient language skills. Their grouping as Muslim women comes coupled with an even more troubling understanding of diaspora being espoused here. The evocation of nostalgia and sadness through the event resonates with the definition of diaspora as a group defining itself through forced migration and exile and harboring a lingering desire to return to the homeland. As scholars Parvati Raman and Stuart Hall have extensively argued, this understanding of diaspora ignores the fact that diasporic identification is very often a strategic form of self-representation. There is much agency in choosing to identify oneself as a member of a diaspora. And furthermore, diasporic communities and cultures change over time as they respond to ongoing political, social, economic, and cultural circumstances. For me, the limited understanding of the South Asian experience presented in this roadshow stands testament to the ongoing limited understanding with which many museums approach the question of cultural diversity in the UK. And in fact, merely 6 years after the nomination of the ship's gallery as the priceless object, the gallery has now been shut down since May 2012. I went looking for traces of the gallery and the performance amongst the museum's current display, which goes by the name of The Making of the Modern World. All that I found was a small model of the evolution of boats from tree trunks, which showed the little figure of a man sitting inside the boat getting progressively whiter and more European looking as the boats evolved. Another boat, a model of the SS Oceanic from 1899, was accompanied by a label describing the importance of transatlantic liners in fostering trade with the Americas, making no mention whatsoever of the role of these ships in the forging and aftermath of empire. All traces of the Priceless Roadshow and its conceptual attempts to highlight intertwined histories between maritime travel and the aftermath of colonialism were completely invisible. So to conclude, returning to the question of how South Asia has been shown and framed in Britain, I would argue that Priceless highlights ongoing stereotypes, cultural misgroupings, and outdated definitions of diaspora which linger in many museums' outlooks. This is visible when looking at how this project was subsumed in part into the wider institutional agendas, including into what Kobina Mirza has described as the phenomenon of multicultural exhibitionism. Yet, as Claire Bishop reminds us, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that this performance and most participatory artworks are, first and foremost, works of art. To claim that this work left no visible legacy and thus failed, I believe, is a very unfair judgment. It is important to recognize the artist's effort to interrogate hidden power structures and invisible histories, and that this represents an important conceptual attempt to interrogate the legacy also of museums established on the foundations of colonialism. Their attempt echoes the words of Ariella Azule when she writes, "Instead of regarding the archive as an institution that preserves the past through its contents which do not directly impact us, I propose to see the archive as a shared place, a place that enables one to maintain the past incomplete. Nevertheless, as many of the papers of this conference have shown, it is impossible to turn a blind eye to the overarching influence of institutional agendas and outlooks, many of which, I would say, are sadly moving at a much slower pace than the works of art which they're commissioning, hosting, and displaying. Thank you.